Yeah, sure. I
as
think
as
I
possible.
replied to your email, right? Um, have I replied or no?
Um, I checked 2 minutes back and it wasn't there.
Oh, okay. Wait, this is about the nebulae, right?
No, sir.
No. Okay. So ask me the question. I'll just answer it right now while we are waiting
Uh,
for this to
so
load.
the question in like very brief is, so we were interested in observing variable stars, in particular auroral array
Mhm.
variables,
Mhm.
and we know that these objects are readily found in globular clusters.
Ah,
So
yes. Okay. So, yeah, I remember the gist of your email. So the bottom line is this, that it is one of the problems that you are thinking about. So that is a good problem, whether globular clusters you will be able to see them or not. You know the typical size of the images that are formed in GIT, which is 1 arcsecond. So that is what you can use your weekend for. So you and your team members each can take up one globular cluster. Easy way is to look up the size of that globular cluster. You want it to be 5-6 arc minutes so that the outskirts will stretch out to about 10 arc minutes or so. And from that you can start looking, search on ADS and so on, see if you can find it. Proceed on that line. If any of the globulars that you find is not appropriate, will help you find another target. So this is something for everyone who's doing projects. The reason why you are talking about a class of objects right now and each person investigates one object is that you can then decide which of them is most feasible. An implied subtext is that we will also look at which of them is most feasible. And if we find that they are all infeasible, then we'll give you something else to work on those lines. There might occasionally be cases where the entire project is deemed infeasible. That's okay. We'll help you move to something else as well. The more you interact with us right now, the less likely it is that your entire project is infeasible. Okay, so coming back to this question, a much bigger problem that you have to worry about when you're studying variable stars is how many observations do you need? It is very easy to imagine that with a few observations you'll get a nice variable light curve, but you have now all looked at your eclipsing binaries problem. And some of you have actually plotted with folding, some have plotted without folding, but that has given you a very good idea of what kind of data to expect. And that was some 20-30 data points or so. We are talking about lesser data points than that for a typical project. So how would you space your observations? If you have an object whose period is 24 hours, just as an example, then suppose the brightest peak happens right now, then tomorrow also it will happen around the same time, just a few minutes here and there. And it means that you'll never catch the brightness peak within the period of a month or so. So you also have to worry about how do you sample the data and so on. These are intricacies that you learn as you go along, and that is where discussing is helpful. I see some more people have joined, so let me reiterate that discussing on the projects channel will be most effective. That way you can also follow what others are discussing and you get to learn from everyone's experience. Okay, so think about how many observations you would want and how you would want them in particular for this RR question.
sir, another far more general question
Mhm.
could be related to all groups. So what will we actually get from the telescope?
We will give you raw data, okay, if you want. So we'll dump you with the data files if you are adventurous enough and you want to reduce them. In most cases what we will give you is what is called reduced data. So there is some basic processing that has to be done to all images. I will cover that in Tuesday's lecture, and that basic processing will have been done for your images. So for example, we will have corrected for camera effects. We will incorporate into the images something called an astrometric solution, which will tell you what the coordinates of every star in that image are. So those things will already be done for you. And from there, it is up to you how you want to process the data further. Also, some of these things might not mean too much to people right now, but it's okay. What you are doing about your projects right now, you have enough information from the course to do those parts. By the time you actually get your hands on data, we will have done a few more sessions about how to actually do data analysis. What is the data like? Today we'll cover telescopes and their functioning. Um, Next week, we will talk about detectors and then images and so on. Then we'll go into more details on coordinate systems. We'll go into more details on image processing. You'll know all of that by the time you actually get your hands on data. Right now, just to continue the example of RR Lyre, you want to measure brightness as a function of time of some object. You really don't need to know the details of your instrument right now. Beyond knowing that it works in a certain brightness range and it can observe only at night, that is enough. For other projects where you are talking about angular resolution and so on, then knowing that it can resolve only about an arc second and not better than that is all you need to know. Right? If you try to zoom in beyond that, nothing good really comes out, and we'll cover that reason today in today's class, hopefully. All right. With that note, again, encourage everyone to talk to us, talk to your TAs about your projects. Coming in at the last moment is not going to help. The entire idea behind the projects is that you have to think about it, and that way you get to learn more. I'd like to remind everyone that this is an elective. You opted for this, so don't try shortcuts now. The other part is that Gaurav has posted a video today about how the assignment is to be solved, and we'll give you the graded assignments back in a couple of days, hopefully, definitely in 4 or 5 days. But if you have not seen that video yet, please go take a look. And if you have any doubts after that, I would suggest again fast turnaround would be posting the doubts there itself, and we'll try to answer them there. Otherwise, we'll answer them in a subsequent lecture. And the last point in terms of general announcements is that before the Acad office decided to take mid-semester feedback, we had designed our own feedback form and were about to circulate it to all of you anyway. So this is not some miscellaneous exercise that the institute conducts and ignores. I want to know what you people are liking about the course, what you're not liking. Online teaching is different from classroom teaching. You all may have different set of expectations from that. So please do express all of that. Also, what kind of stuff would you like to see covered in the course more? There is always leeway to go along with what we are actually what everybody's interests are. Also, I see that about half the people attend the lecture live. The others probably see it on YouTube. I have not been keeping up with YouTube views or whatever, but feedback from everyone is desired, whether you are attending live lectures or not. And if you are not attending live lectures, are there any other avenues you need for interaction apart from putting questions on Teams? All right. So with that, let's come to today's topic. We are going to talk about, yeah.
Varun, while we are at it, there was one more announcement regarding project teams, right?
Yes, there are still, thanks, Gaurav. There are a few students who have still not formed teams, and there are a couple of teams from which one or two students who were parts of those teams have actually withdrawn from the course. I have written an email to everyone who had not submitted assignment one. The same thing applies for teams here as well. Make sure that people in your team are actually going to continue with the course. Otherwise, you will be with fewer people to work with later in the course. Also, if you are planning to withdraw, now would be a good time to just drop me a message saying I may or may not withdraw. If you are not yet sure, that's also fine. But remember, once you are in a project group, then if you leave in between, that puts the rest of the group in trouble as well. So let's try avoiding that. Okay. If you have not seen your team yet, then check out the Google Sheet again. Make sure that your team is correct. Make sure you're not on two teams. We found one person who had accidentally gotten listed into two teams. We have fixed that. So take a look at that sheet again. Gaurav or anyone, was there anything else that we were going to talk about?
No, I think you covered most of it. So.
All right, sounds good. So,
hello, sir.
Yes.
Hello. Sir, I'm Divakar.
Yes, Divakar, go ahead.
Sir, in our group, two people are already withdrawn from the course.
Okay. So what we can... Oops, sorry, just a moment. Yeah.
And,
so what we can do is that we can help you identify other people who can actually join club teams. So can you send me a message on Teams later so that we can help you fix that?
Yes, sir. I will send you message
Okay,
for
thanks.
project.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so today's topic is telescopes. Okay, and I'll start with a general question for all of you. Why do we want telescopes? What is the purpose of having a telescope? Anyone?
I guess the most simple answer would be to see.
Correct. To see what?
See beyond what the human eye can see.
That's a very interesting choice of words. Okay, so to see beyond what the eye can see. What do you mean by beyond?
Beyond can mean things like objects which are dim or objects that don't lie in the optical regime, and
Okay, so they
objects
can be
that are not
dimmer,
even
they can be
electromagnetic, like
farther.
gravitational or whatever.
Okay, so telescope conventionally we do limit ourselves to electromagnetic radiation, but yes, non-optical is a point very well taken. I didn't expect it to come up so quickly in the answer. So yes, usually when you think about a telescope, you think about seeing things which are dimmer or which are further away. Okay, and other than that, of course, these days we use telescopes for a lot of other wavelengths. So we have radio telescopes, we have um, X-ray telescopes, gamma ray telescopes, and so on. So for today's discussion, we'll largely talk about optical telescopes. Okay. Now, to look at these two aspects here, okay, when I say that we can see things which are dimmer, how can we see dimmer or fainter things with a telescope?
We increase the aperture, I guess,
Okay, so
or
in
the
simpler
exposure time.
terms, we gather more light, right? We
Yeah,
have some kind of a lens which is taking light from this much of an area, putting it into a much smaller area so that if a source is giving you a certain flux, a certain number of photons per square centimeter or certain number of ergs per square centimeter, if you collect it from a larger area, then you are going to be able to see fainter objects because you are just getting more photons. How about seeing things which are further away? Why can we see things which are further away?
Same logic, I guess.
Um, that doesn't necessarily have to work, right? Suppose I am using a telescope to look at trees which are far away. The trees are not really that much fainter. They don't really appear. I mean, they are. There is less scattered light coming to you, but that's not the primary reason there.
Magnify things.
To
That
yeah,
yeah. What else were you saying? Someone else?
yeah, so I was saying like to focus on some less area to distance. Yeah,
Okay, so you point at a very specific area. Okay,
yeah.
specific uh, field of view. That is a what do you say? That is a property of the telescope. You don't see everything, but that is not the reason why you really need a telescope, right? If I want to limit myself to a very specific part, I can just take a paper, roll it up in a tube, and look through that. Okay, this is limiting what I can see with this eye, but it is not really giving me any magnification. There are times when that is helpful. In amateur astronomy, we have sometimes done things like that because when your eye gets less stray light, the pupil of your eye actually dilates more and you can see a bit fainter objects. But that's a different story. So the two main reasons that we actually go for a telescope are these two. We want to gather more light and we want to magnify things a little bit. Now, magnification is something which deserves more attention. Okay. I'm sure you have seen all of these enhance kind of jokes where you are talking about taking a picture and you keep on zooming and you do image processing. That really doesn't work in real life, right? So magnification, there is a limit. What would be causing that limit?
The length, no, the interaction length of photons.
That's a slightly convoluted way of saying it. Can you elaborate a bit more?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the general geometric optics assumes that rays are infinitely thin, like beams
Okay.
of light, but since photons start interacting with matter after a certain range, in some range
Okay.
of the
That is
wavelength, that
broadly correct. Let's try to be more specific. Anyone else?
Diffraction or something.
Right. So there is a limit that is coming from diffraction. Okay, which is kind of what Akash was saying, but a bit more concise answer. Okay, so what happens is that if you have light that is going through a slit, right? You are all aware of Young's double slit experiment and so on. You get diffraction from the individual points, then you get interference patterns from it. If I have a single aperture, then that does create diffraction. Usually in diffraction, you tend to think of an infinite light wave and a solid object in between. So um, I have light which is coming this way, and then if I put some screen in between, let's say, um, ah, let's say I put a screen here, then what's going to happen is that the light waves are actually going to, as they come here, they are going to curve around that screen in some sense. But that is not the only way you can get diffraction. Instead of that, I can have the same idea where I have a plane parallel wavefront that is coming in. But now I put a hollow in a screen, and again I get the same idea. I start seeing diffraction of light around those edges. So a 2D version of this is that when I have a circular aperture, I get diffraction at a circular aperture as well. And from that diffraction at a circular aperture, you get a certain minimum angular resolution. And that minimum angular resolution, so what happens is diffraction at a circular aperture. So what you end up getting is an intensity profile that roughly looks like this. A bit more symmetric than what I've drawn. Let's try to fix that. Okay, and this, if you were to look at it from the top, would look like this. So you would have this bright ring at the center. I'm drawing black as brighter because otherwise I'll be shading this sheet for a long time. And then outside that you will have other rings as well. And then there will be a third ring and so on. So this is called a airy disk. And now what happens as a result is that even if I have a point object, okay, if my source is a point source, the minimum size of my image is about this much. This has nothing to do with my detector. This has to do only with the fact that I'm using a circular aperture, a lens. There's a plane parallel wave coming in and it comes in only through my lens. So as a result, I am going to get a certain minimum size, and that size is roughly given by 1.22 lambda by d, where this is called the aperture. Oops. And this is the wavelength, of course, at which you are observing. Okay, so what is 1.22 lambda by d? That is not exactly the width of this. If I had a second source, then that source would cause its own diffraction pattern. And this minimum separation, where what I have done here is I have lined up the peak of this second source with the trough of the first source. So the brightest point of the second source lies in between. So if I were to look at this as a top view again, then the second source is sitting somewhere here. Okay, this is what I am trying to achieve. And that is what has been defined as the minimum angular resolution. Now you can see that there are going to be a bunch of issues here, and I need you to be aware of those issues because they are often forgotten. if I have to, okay, so let's understand what this means in the sky. Okay, so this is an angle, first thing. Okay, this is, oops, we need a thinner pen here, theta equal to, and of course this theta is going to be in what units?
Rad.
Correct.
Seconds.
So this is, no, this is in theta is going to be in radians. And then you can convert it to arc seconds and so on. You will typically get numbers which are in arc seconds or so for relevant choices. But by default, this is a ratios of wavelength which has units of distance, aperture which has units of distance, and the ratio of the two is dimensionless. Taking place here, what we are now looking at is if I have a separation between two objects on the sky such that they are at this angle, theta radians, away from each other, then those two images will look like my black and orange blobs on the screen here. Okay, hopefully a bit better than what I have drawn, but that's the broad idea. Now, if I change that separation to 1.21 lambda by d, it's not as if those blobs are going to stick together and suddenly coalesce into a single blob. Okay, or if I make it to 1.23, then that's not suddenly going to make them two entirely separate entities. Okay, this is a heuristic, this is an approximate idea where we are saying, okay, if I have this kind of a wavy pattern that has been drawn over here, then if the peak of one wavy pattern aligns with the smallest point of the other, then that should make it easy enough to separate them. Okay, that's the overall idea that we are following here. So based on that, this is the minimum separation between two objects. This is also called the resolution of a telescope. Yes, Himanshi.
Sir, I didn't quite get like when you are observing a single object, what is this minimum image size? I didn't get that part.
This is the size. If I had a detector with infinite resolution, with pixels that are nanometers in size or whatever, if I imaged a single star, then the image of the single star would look like this black set of things that I have drawn here. Okay, I have of course cut it off because I was running out of paper, but this would continue up here, down here, and so on. Okay, this is called an Airy disk, and that is what the image of any single point source would actually look like. And that is because as the light crosses through your primary lens, it is actually getting diffracted, and this is the diffraction pattern that you're seeing.
Okay, sir.
What it means is that the orange one also is going to have its own set of rings. So that's going to be something like this over here. Okay. Another thing it means is that if the orange source instead was a much fainter source, okay, keep forgetting the thickness. Suppose it was a much fainter source. Okay, if the source is fainter, the pattern does not become narrower. The size of the pattern is same, but the height goes down. Okay, so I see this purple. I don't know if you can make out that it is purple there, but this is now a fainter source. Even though that fainter source is in that dip, technically, it will still be hard to see because it is too close to a bright source. The contrast might not be enough. So just this resolution factor is not enough. There do exist other factors that you have to worry about when we are doing this. Okay, so this is something I wanted to get clarified right at the start. Let us try to calculate something. I hope all of you have some kind of a calculator accessible. Let's try to calculate the angular resolution of the Growth India telescope. Okay, so I have lambda. Let's say we are observing in optical. Let's assume some mean wavelength. So what is the optical range of wavelengths?
400 to 700 nanometers.
400 to 700. Okay. So let's take both the limits of that. Let's take 400 nanometers and let's take lambda equal to 700 nanometers. Okay. And then diameter is 70 centimeters. Can you go ahead and calculate what the angular resolution is for the Growth India telescope? So theta blue is going to be 1.22. I hope you are actually doing it and not waiting for me to solve it. And this is in radians, so we have to convert it later into arc seconds. So angle in arc seconds is equal to 2 into 10 raised to 6 times, sorry, ulta.
691 radian.
How much, sorry?
0.45 arc seconds
That is for blue.
for 400 nanometer. Yeah.
Okay, can anyone else confirm this value? What about red, by the way?
I'm getting a different answer for blue. I don't know why.
It could be that the first answer is wrong. Everyone is trying to calculate fast here. So I'm going to wait. I know this feels weird when you're just staring at your screen and waiting for things to happen. I can just keep giving you background noise in the meanwhile, but you still actually have to solve this. It's a live lecture. You're not exactly going to pause and solve it.
I'm getting 0.14 arc seconds for blue.
Yeah,
Okay.
0.14. I missed the factor of pi while converting.
Okay. I'm going to try and verify this myself. Yeah, 0.14 is the actual answer, not 0.445. In the meanwhile, what about the red side?
0.25.
0.25.
Okay, so this is already an interesting lesson right here. We don't realize, but our optical view actually covers almost a factor of 2 in wavelengths. So the resolution that you get is actually quite different in the two things. Okay, and the size of that airy disk is going to be quite different. So what we are looking at here is that if we look at those airy disks in blue, okay, so suppose I have a star right here on my axis, and the blue light is going to give me a pattern which is going to be like this. Whereas the red light that I get from the same star is going to give me a much wider pattern. Okay, so the sharpness of your image is going to be some average sharpness because you are getting actually light from all wavelengths, and that is going to get combined into your image. Very recently, there is a pretty cool paper on the archive, research paper, which talks about using this effect to actually do spectroscopy. Based on the fact that you have different point spread. This thing is called a point spread function. I have a point source, and this is how the light from that source is spreading. This is not just about diffraction, this is about everything. So PSF, or point spread function, right? I have light that should have been a point, but it is spread around. So point spread function. And they have used this for actually figuring out the colors of stars based on just this idea. Anyway, so point spread function now. Here you got answers that are 0.14 and 0.25 arc seconds. Those of you who did not complete the calculation right now, please do go and verify those numbers later. So the point spread function I have been telling you is 1 to 2 arc seconds that you should talk about. And that is not quite the number that you saw. To explain this, I can point you back to that twinkling animation that I talked about. Okay, so there are several factors that are actually contributing here. What happens is that apart from your telescope diffraction issues, there's the entire atmosphere above you, and the atmosphere is undulating. Okay, you can think of it as different layers which are moving around. And if you have a hotter layer or a cooler layer, then it actually has a slightly different index of refraction. And because the refractive index changes, it means that light actually, the path of the light waves coming through changes, which means that it is effectively acting like random lenses in between. It's like looking through frosted glass. Fortunately, the effect is not too strong, but it does limit the overall thing by a factor called seeing. Okay, this is effect of the atmosphere. And it gives the overall point spread function or the seeing disk size that is now dependent on what site you are observing at and the atmospheric conditions at that point. So typically it is few arc seconds. Say 1 arc second is fine for decent site. It is about half an arc second or so for best, and it can be as bad as 10 arc seconds for say cities. Okay, you can have really bad turbulence in cities. In addition, of course, there's also light pollution in cities. Okay, so usually when we think of a telescope, we naturally tend to think of a lens system. Okay, and broadly, what would be a refracting telescope? So we have a lens, and we have light which is coming in, and as it goes through the lens, it actually converges to a focal point, and that would be your standard. Is this color visible, or should I use some other color here?
Other color.
Another one.
Not quite. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start again with our telescope. And probably a thicker pen as well. Okay, so I have light incident from here. The middle ray is going to get straight through. Other rays are going to converge at a focus. And in the simplest telescope design, this would be it. Okay, you need a second lens, which could be the lens of your eye, which could be another lens, but a basic telescope, this is meeting your requirements. It is taking the first requirement, which is that it had to gather light and bring it together to a point. What you could have done is already at this place, you could have simply put a detector, and you, let's say this can be a film camera or a CCD camera or anything, and you will form an image, okay, of whatever source that you have. So there are few nomenclatures that we have to know. This is usually called the primary. This point, of course, is called the focus. And the size of the primary is usually called the aperture. Okay, so aperture refers to the diameter of the primary. Now with lenses, there are a bunch of issues though. First is that both the surfaces of my lens actually matter. So I have to have two good quality optical surfaces. The second thing is that in a lens, I actually get what is called chromatic aberration. So remember that if you just look in at say one part of this lens, say this one, this pretty much looks like a prism. Maybe I'll highlight the lower one so that I have space to write. So if you look at say this part of the lens, looks like a prism. This is just to make it obvious and intuitive for you, which means that light as it is passing through that is going to split. What color of light bends more in a prism? Red bends more or blue?
Blue.
Pakka?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go with blue. So what is going to happen is that I have optical light, remember big range of wavelengths. So if I have blue light coming in, then that is actually going to get focused slightly closer to the aperture. So as a result, the net effect is that different colors or different wavelength have different foci. Okay, and this is called chromatic aberration. Aberration means any imperfection or distortion in image quality, So what is going to happen is that these rays, by the time they reach that detector in the focal plane, that is actually going to be spread out a bit. So you can either focus the red light or the blue light, but other wavelengths are going to get defocused. A few other nomenclature terms here. This distance here is called the focal length. And then this plane over here is called the focal plane. Okay, I know I'm drawing too many things on one diagram, but you are free to redraw it yourself in order to make sure that you get it right. Also, the primary axis that is going through is called the optical axis or the bore sight. So let's try another color. So this axis here, which would be perpendicular to your aperture, okay, and essentially marked by this first ray of light that I had drawn. This is the optical axis, also known as the bore sight. Okay, so that is where the telescope is pointing. Let's look at the terms again. I have a lens. The diameter of that lens is the aperture. The lens is called the primary. Light is getting focused. The point where it is getting focused, I put a detector or some surface that is actually parallel to my lens. That is the focal plane. And then the focal length is the distance between the primary and the focal plane. And the primary axis is the axis along which light is shining. All right. So one problem with the lens is while making a lens, I have to worry about both the surfaces, the front and the back surface. That's a lot of work. Second thing is, as I try to make larger and larger lenses, things become tricky. I can only support the lens from the side, which means that the center, now for a very large lens, the center can be quite thick, and that can actually start sagging under its own weight. So the optical quality is actually going to get quite distorted in the process. The third thing, of course, is chromatic aberration that we talked about. So there are a bunch of problems that we have here in lenses. And as a result, lenses are not very popular for large sized optical telescopes. Okay, instead of that, we use what are called reflecting telescopes. Let me list out fourth problem that I did not talk about. Every surface that light passes through, you don't actually get 100% transmission. You get some reflection coming from different surfaces as well. So as a result, the net effect is that you are losing more light when you introduce more optical lenses, more optical elements in your imaging system. So a lens, you are more likely to end up losing some light. So these are the disadvantages of refracting telescopes, which is why we usually switch to what are called reflecting telescopes. Himansh has a question.
Yes, sir. So like the exercise we did of calculating theta. So like does that mean ki for the human eye we see red objects considerably worse than the blue objects?
Not really. So the angular resolution of the human eye is quite a complicated question. The human eye does not work like a normal grid of pixels. Okay, you have all these cells, and the density of cells is different across your retina actually. So the central part has more closely packed cells. The sides have less closely packed cells. There's actually a blind spot where your optic nerve goes in. So it becomes quite tricky. But the net angular resolution of the human eye is about an arc minute. And I'm not aware if there have been any experiments specifically that tried to measure our angular resolution in red and blue. It is a simple thing that you can try out, by the way. So I would recommend doing that experiment. What you can do is you can actually draw lines, red lines on your computer screen, and slowly start zooming out and see at what point you can no longer tell them apart. And at the same resolution, draw blue lines as well. See if you can resolve one while the other is still not resolvable. So this is an interesting and simple experiment for any of you to try out, and do let the class know what results you get. All right, so let us now move to reflecting telescopes. So here, instead of spending a lot of time drawing a lot of lines, I thought it is easier if I simply use a presentation. So let's do this. So The idea with reflecting telescopes basically is that you have to start with conic sections. Okay, so the first property that you will remember is that if you have a parabola, then if you have light which is coming in or any ray that is coming in parallel to the principal axis of the parabola, then it gets reflected back to the central focus of the parabola. Okay, and this is the part, the lowest part here, that we use for an optical telescope. So what I'm doing is that I was using a lens to focus all the light into one point. Instead of that, I'm now going to use a parabola to focus light into a single point. For completeness, we should also remember that there are two other conic sections, the ellipse and the hyperbola. They also have interesting properties of reflection, which do matter for telescopes. So for an ellipse, you have two foci instead of one. And if I have a ray of light that is shining from one focus, if it shines on any part of the ellipse, the reflected light is actually going to go to the second focus. For a hyperbola, it is the other way around. You have two foci again, but now if I had a ray that was coming from outside and was actually heading towards one of the foci, so this ray is coming from here and it would have hit this focus if this surface was not present in between. This will now get reflected and it will make its way to the other focus. So what I can do is I can use combinations of these three conic sections, the ellipse, hyperbola and parabola. And by using those, I can actually start making telescopes. So this is the basic design, a Newtonian telescope. So this dashed line here is the optical axis. And what is used here is this now is your primary. The width of this would be your aperture. Look at the purple lines, light coming in here would have been reflected to the focus of the parabola, which is over here. Okay. And instead of that, what is done is, of course, if I have this mirror and I'm standing in front of it, I am actually going to be casting a shadow. So you don't want that. Instead of that, what you do is you cast a much smaller shadow. You put a flat mirror here. This is called a secondary mirror. So I have a parabolic primary mirror and I have a flat secondary mirror. And the secondary now reflects the light here. So this is simply geometric optics here, and this would be my focal point. So this red horizontal line here would be the focal plane. Okay, this green set of lines here is an object which is making a small angle in the sky from the purple one, and those rays will also get focused and they will come here. So this kind of explains the word focal plane. Roughly speaking, the foci for different off-axis angles form a plane. It is not always a flat, strict planar surface. Sometimes it can have slight curvature and so on, and additional optical elements need to be added in to correct for that. Okay, so this is the most basic reflecting telescope design. It's a Newtonian telescope. You have other variants. So this is called a Cassegrain telescope. So what is done here is that you have a parabolic primary mirror, but now this is a hyperbolic secondary mirror. Okay, so this is one surface of the hyperbola. What I do is I line up the focus, one of the foci of the hyperbola with the focus of the primary. So any light rays that were reflected from the primary would have been making its way to the focus of the parabola, which is also the first focus of this hyperbola. So they are going to get reflected from this hyperbolic surface and make their way to the second focus of the hyperbola. Okay, there is something quite interesting here. Note that what happens as a result is that this focal length is effectively increasing. The distance between this secondary to this point is much smaller than the distance from here to here. Okay, so let's look at this again. This light, instead of going just here from the point of reflection, travels much further to the second focus. What that means is that I can actually put a smaller mirror here. So in a Cassegrain telescope, my secondary can be smaller. It gives me less obscuration. The second advantage of this is that my primary mirror usually is going to be heavy, and I will have good supporting structures around my mirror there. And I can now have my secondary focus over here. I cut a hole in my mirror actually at the center, and light is coming through that, and I can actually have more room here to mount more complicated instruments. I was actually trying to find some photographs of various telescopes that I've been to before this lecture, but unfortunately I couldn't. I'll share those materials with you later. So this gives us a longer focal length, and why a longer focal length matters will come into picture much later when we talk about something called the plate scale. Okay, hopefully we'll get to it in today's lecture itself. So now I have a parabolic primary mirror, hyperbolic secondary mirror. This would have been my primary focus. This is my secondary focus. Okay, there are other variants of this. There is something called a Schmidt-Cassegrain design where a parabolic mirror is difficult to make. A spherical mirror is much easier to make, but a spherical mirror actually suffers from a problem called a spherical aberration. Okay, so let me try to explain this problem in short. If I have a spherical surface, okay, I'm drawing it all the way as a hemisphere. This is my center of curvature. Okay, you may remember from optics that your radius of curvature is twice of your focal length. Is that right? Anyone?
Yeah.
Or is it the other way around? Is it half?
No, it's twice of the focal length.
Radius is twice.
Okay, good. So some people remember optics, that is good. So you would have these light rays getting into focus somewhere here. But now let me imagine a light ray that is much further away. Something that is coming here is clearly not going to get reflected here, right? At grazing incidence, this will actually try to go through. It might suffer a secondary reflection before it goes somewhere here. So as I go further and further out, my focus actually moves further and further back in. So the focus for the central part of the telescope is here. If I am looking at, say, this part of the telescope, the focus would be somewhere here and so on. So this is called spherical aberration. Okay, so now I have a problem. If I want to have my Cassegrain design, then I need a parabolic primary, but parabolas are hard to make. I can make spheres much easier, but then I start getting spherical aberration. So what Mr. Schmidt did is that he put a lens here. Okay, so this is a lens element, a corrective lens that actually bends light on its way in itself in order to correct for this aberration. And you can see that the lens is not flat. It's actually a weird shaped lens, a very particular shape that he calculated. And thanks to that shape, it actually nullifies. So it's like adding spectacles for your primary. Okay, and that then gives you a good image quality at the focus. There are many other telescope types. For example, there is something called a Dahl-Kirkham telescope, and the Growth India telescope uses what is called corrected Dahl-Kirkham optics. So this is just for you to know. There exist many designs. There is something called a Ritchie-Cheriton. There is Maksutov Cassegrain, and so on. Okay, so a lot of different types of telescopes have been used. The second point is the foci that we talked about. Where does the light get focused? So I already mentioned these 2 points. This is the primary focus. This is the secondary focus. In addition, what I can also do is I can put a mirror here and send off light to the side. Okay, and why we would do that will become a bit more clear when we get to mounts. So this is called an azimuth focus. Okay, when I have light coming here. And sometimes if you have very heavy equipment, then you can't actually mount it with your telescope. And in order to fix that, what you do is that your telescope, these days you actually put a fiber optic cable. So your telescope focuses light into a fiber optic cable, and then you take it to some heavy equipment that is mounted somewhere. In olden days, they had to do it all the way with mirrors. And for that, they had something called a Coudé focus, which comes after a few more reflections from this point. But primary, secondary, and azimuth foci are most important. If you look at large telescope these days, a small fraction of instruments actually sits at the primary focus. Several instruments often sit at a secondary focus. And a lot of instruments in large telescopes will often sit at the azimuth focus, including the Growth India telescope. Okay, so our imaging system sits at the azimuth focus. Any questions so far before we go to mounts?
Sir?
Yes.
So the property of the conic section is key. It will focus light rays parallel to its to the axis at a particular point. But
That
in the
is
figure,
property of a parabola,
yes, sir,
not for
sorry.
an ellipse or a hyperbola. Yes.
Yeah, so a parabola does that, but you need the light rays to be parallel to the principal axis. But in the figure, the green light was actually slightly inclined. So won't it focus somewhere else instead of the
Correct.
focal plane?
That is precisely right. So if we look at this one again, this is a point on the principal axis, which is the primary focus for light rays which are coming in parallel to the boresight or the principal axis, optical axis of the telescope. As I go slightly further away, the green rays are still parallel to each other, but they are not parallel to the optical axis anymore. And what happens then is that they do not converge at the same focus, they converge somewhere else. So if I move this light source around, okay, so I have my primary here and I have a light source shining from here. If I move it around, then instead of light rays getting focused here, they get focused at other places. Okay. This focusing is not perfect and it leads to various other aberrations. We looked at chromatic aberration and spherical aberration, two types. Chromatic was seen in case of the lenses primarily, and we saw spherical aberration if the primary was a sphere or a section of a sphere. There are others like coma and astigmatism, defocus, and so on. They all come in because of this problem, because as you go off axis, your rays are no longer getting perfectly sharply focused. And then you start making more and more complicated designs of optics and you start putting in other corrective elements. So just as we had the Schmidt plate here for correcting this, you can start putting in other corrective elements in order to get this image quality, to retain good image quality over here.
Sorry, sir, that isn't that angular magnification? I don't
Sorry.
understand how that aberration.
No. We are not talking of. Okay, so let me try to put it another way. Okay, if I looked at an image here, okay, at the purple focus, I would get that nice airy disk. Okay, this over here would not remain the same symmetric airy disk anymore. It will become asymmetric, and depending on how far off axis you are, the quality will degrade further and further. Does that make sense to you people, or should I explain it more? Does that clear your doubt? Okay, maybe let's switch back to a whiteboard and try to look at this again. Okay, so let us consider our simple ray optics. Okay. So I have my lens, and if I have rays that are coming in parallel to the principal axis, they are going to get focused here. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take different rays which are coming from slightly away from the primary axis. Okay, at some angle. So the central ray still goes straight. Okay. This light is still going to get focused. It will just get focused somewhere else. Right. That is how we do all of our lens diagrams in the thin lens approximation.
We're still assuming one point object, right?
Each of these is a point object is what I am assuming. So if I were, so in your usual calculations, what you would do is that if I had some kind of object placed here, okay, then you would have said that, okay, over here I am forming an inverted image. And then the orange ray would have been coming from here and the black ray would have been coming from here. Right? That is how you would have done your usual ray diagrams. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, now in doing all of this, when we are doing the, I don't know how many of you have actually done derivations for this, but in doing all of this, we work under the assumption that this angle that we are looking at, okay, theta is small. Okay, that is when your geometric optics assumption usually works. And what I am saying now is that over here at the center, the black image which you are seeing, this will be sharp. Okay, As I go further and further off axis, suppose I now go to some huge angle like this. Okay, my rays are no longer going to get focused at the same point even. Okay, so I'm not going to get no good image over here. Okay, but at this point, the orange point in between, I will still have a decent image. It won't be as sharp, but an image will still be formed. Does everyone agree with me up to here?
Yeah.
So the same thing was happening there with the mirror as well. When you go into details, what is going to happen here is to how decent is this decent image and is it acceptable depends on the quality of optics and the detailed design, which is why there are so many variants where we said, okay, Newtonian does this, but there are some drawbacks. There are drawbacks about mechanical structure as well. Schmidt-Cassegrain seems to manage it. Cassegrain manages it better. Schmidt-Cassegrain even better. Corrected Dahl-Kirkham is much better if you want a wide field of view, which is what we wanted for the Growth India telescope. If you want just light gathering, then RC telescope can do it, a Ritchie-Sheraton telescope. So those are all the different telescope types where on axis, most telescopes will give you sharp images. But as you start going off axis, image quality degrades. And how much will it degrade? Of course, if you keep putting in more and more optical elements, you are losing light. You do better and better engineering, the telescope becomes more expensive. So these are all trade-offs that matter when you are actually considering designing or building or buying a telescope.
Sir, I have one doubt. Like,
Yes,
from the secondary mirror, there will be some diffraction, right?
correct.
Because
Correct.
so
The
how
secondary
to
mirror
deal with
will
that?
also cause some diffraction, which would have mattered if you have a plane parallel wave coming in kind of thing. Okay. The smaller secondary, the rays that you are getting in are already converging rays. Okay, so you can't, your normal derivation of diffraction from that does not quite apply. But what happens is, for example, if we have, okay, so let me tell you where we do see effects of this. Okay, remember the Newtonian telescope design, which was essentially, I had a tube, and in that tube I had my mirror mounted over here, and I had drawn a secondary mirror over here. Okay. Now this secondary mirror, what this is going to do, let me put it in the center. What this secondary mirror is trying to do is that I have light coming in, getting focused, and that secondary mirror is sending it aside to the focus. Now the secondary mirror in this diagram, so far so good, but in practice that can't just be floating in midair over there, right? We have to do something about it. So if I look at it from the side, okay, front view, then what I will see is that I will see a circular tube. I will see the secondary mirror in between, but you will actually see mirror supports. Okay, typically they use just 3. This is called a spider. Okay, and as light is coming in from this, you actually get diffraction from the spider. Okay, and this causes diffraction. And if you have good enough quality detectors, you can actually see those diffraction spikes. Okay, spider is nothing but secondary support. Now these diffraction spikes are usually faint, so they become visible only if your source is very bright. So yes, sometimes these other elements in the optics train can cause problems because they are also going to diffract light. The secondary being smaller than the primary does not limit the resolution to the size of the secondary. You have converging rays. I think rather than trying to go into more detail about this right now, what I will do is I will look up some good references about this and share this. Someone else had their hand up?
Yes, sir. So I have one more doubt. The focus point is changing, so it can be off axis and on axis. So is this phenomena affect the relative distance in the sky we see from the human eye and
Focus
from
is
the
not
telescope?
changing. No. Focus is not changing. See, think of it this way, right? If I have a plane mirror, okay, a simple plane mirror over here. All right. And let me now draw two rays of light. Okay, so one ray is coming like this, and another ray is coming like this. They are incident at the same point. Okay, so the green ray is going to get reflected at the same angle at which it was incident. The red ray is going to get reflected at the angle at which it was incident, right? So I'm not changing the reflection properties of the surface. The rays are going in different directions. Okay. If all the light from no matter where was coming into one point, then that would be a black hole. Not really, but that would focus. The word focus, the focus is a point. If you have a plane parallel beam of light coming in from infinity, okay, so I have my light rays coming like this, and all of them are getting focused at a single point. If I have an extended object, its image is not going to become a point, right? Its image is going to remain extended. Do we agree on that, Pawan?
Yes, sir.
So if the source is extended like this, its image also has to be extended. So rays which were coming from here, they got focused over here. And on the other hand, rays which were coming from here, they got focused over here. Okay, so focus is not changing. And we are assuming right now the source is very far away, much further away than the focal length. So distance is not coming into picture anywhere. What we are talking about is only this theta, okay, which is the angular separation, this thing over here. Okay, that is all that we are talking about.
Okay, sir.
All right. So let us come back from here. Any other questions about this? We have covered quite some ground a bit fast. So we have talked about telescope types, and we have talked about various types of foci in reflecting telescopes. Okay. Can we move on to the next part? I assume
I
that.
had a minor doubt, but
Yes.
does the design affect the resolution of the telescope?
Yes, it does. For example, because it will change the diffraction properties, just like the presence of the spider. If instead of a 3-arm spider, I put a 6-arm spider, I'll get a different shape. In practice, in ground-based telescopes, okay, you've seen that Growth India 70 centimeters, you already got quarter arc-second resolution, which means a telescope roughly 1/4 the size of the Growth India telescope. So 18-20 centimeter telescope already gives you 1 arc-second resolution, which is the limit of the atmosphere anyway. So if you have resolution, if you have an aperture that is larger than about 15-20 centimeters, then you are no longer limited by the diffraction limit of your aperture. You are now limited by the atmosphere for typical observing sites. Okay, why do you still go to larger and larger telescopes? You are no longer doing that for the magnification or the zoom or the resolution. You are doing it now for getting more light. All right. All right, so let's go ahead here. We can now talk about telescope mounts. Okay, so in one discussion we were having in some colleagues once, observatory maintenance staff pointed out that what you really want in a reflecting telescope is that a reflecting telescope, the mirror is made of glass and you coat it with either silver, or usually these days you coat it with aluminum, and that aluminized or silver coated mirror is what is giving you the reflection. So what you are really doing with this telescope is you are collecting a lot of light coming from far away sources, you are focusing it to a point. All of that work is really being done by that thin film which is only a few microns thick. The rest of the structure is all in place only to keep that film where it belongs. Right? The glass mirror, the glass is not doing any reflection. It is only providing a surface on which you actually mount that film. Now, similarly, you have all of this mirror and everything which we are nicely drawing floating around freely. You have to have a mount which holds it in place. Okay, and we'll talk about different types of mounts of telescope. Before I come to the conventional mounts, which I will discuss in detail, there are some unconventional mounts which I wanted to point out. Okay, so the purpose of a mount of a telescope is to be able to take your telescope and point it anywhere. You don't quite want to. So if this were my telescope, I don't want to be holding it around and pointing at things every time. I want it to be, these can often be quite heavy. The Palomar telescope, I think the glass itself weighs about 40 tons. So not exactly something that you can carry around in your pocket. Okay. The most basic mount actually is a fixed mount. Okay, this is the formerly very famous Arecibo telescope. Some of you may be aware that these cables broke and this entire thing fell down. It had imaginarily fallen down in old James Bond movies already. But what was done here is that this is a reflecting radio telescope, which was built in a natural dome in the ground in the middle of mountains. Okay, and Arecibo could only look at sources which were overhead. And it was using that same property which we just discussed, that I can have green rays which are slightly off axis and they'll focus slightly somewhere else. So these cables which are supported from these three towers on the side, these cables can be pulled around to move this entire focal plane. Okay, not the focal plane, this entire instrumentation around to whatever source you want to look at. Of course, it works only up to a certain off-axis angle. Beyond that, you don't see it. So you actually can study a limited set of sources from Arecibo. You wait for the source to come overhead, and then instead of moving the entire telescope to track it, you simply move your instrument around, and beyond a certain range, the image quality is not good enough, so you stop doing it. Arecibo is gone, but there is a Chinese replacement. This is called the FAST 500 meter aperture spherical telescope. This is based in China. This only recently became functional. And that is, as the name says, the aperture, the diameter from here to here is 500 meters. So this is also built in the Natural Valley in China. This applies also for some optical telescopes, by the way. So this is a liquid mirror telescope. What is done is actually quite a nice idea. You take mercury in a tub and you start spinning it. As you start spinning it, there is of course centrifugal force acting, gravity. You can actually solve the equations and the surface actually ends up being a parabola. So you can spin this tub around horizontally like this. And because of that, the mercury will naturally take a parabolic shape, which means that if an object is overhead, I will get a very sharp image. I can't turn this around. I can't move this around. The off-axis angles are pretty limited. So liquid mirror telescopes can actually survey a small strip of the sky. There is a new project called the International Liquid Mirror Telescope based in Nainital, Devasthal near Nainital, actually operated by Ares. I think it is operational. One problem with liquid mirror telescopes is that mercury is actually poisonous. So you can't be in the dome like this when the telescope is operating. It's okay if you are going in for a small photo shoot, but remember to come out quite quickly. All right, the next one is the next type of mount. Okay, a natural, before I come here, let me point out something. A natural mount that I can think of. So I'm going to continue using my water bottle as a demonstrator. Let us assume for simplicity that this end is my lens and here I have some detector. Okay, so if I want to point it to an object, the most natural system that we think about is the altitude azimuth system as usual, right? So what I would do is that I would say point these many degrees above the horizon and along this azimuth. So you have two axes to worry about. One is your altitude axis and one is the azimuth axis. Instead of that, there are actually telescopes which can use azimuth only. I talked about the South Pole telescope. This is a radio telescope working at the South Pole. This platform can rotate like this, okay, horizontally. So the telescope can move around, but its altitude above the ground is actually fixed. And that has several advantages in terms of its background and stability and so on. But it is also intrinsically much cheaper to make it. Instead of worrying about two sets of bearings, you now have to worry about only one. So South Pole telescope actually does that. Also, being at the South Pole, an advantage is that I can everything the South Pole star, which doesn't exist, is overhead, which means that stars are just rotating around me at a fixed altitude above the horizon, right? Last time we discussed that this can't happen in the Arctic because there is actually water at the North Pole. Thank you, global warming. But at the South Pole, you can do this, which means that if I want to image a certain part of the sky for a long time, I will only have to move along one axis to track it. Another case which does this is the Southern African Large Telescope. This is a 10-meter telescope in South Africa. Optical telescope, you can see the mirror here. The mirror actually seems jagged. That is because it is made of hexagonal segment. We will talk about segmented mirrors in a little bit. But this telescope is also fixed to observe at a certain altitude. And they move the entire dome around so that you can point in different azimuths. There too, what happens now is that I can now, instead of image, as opposed to a fixed telescope where I could see only one narrow strip of the sky, what happens is that as an object is rising and setting, its altitude is actually changing. Okay, so this telescope is fixed at a 45-degree altitude. Different objects would come to 45-degree altitude at different points in the night, and that is when you go and image them. This telescope is much cheaper to build as compared to a telescope with two axes of motion, where you have full freedom of movement in altitude and azimuth. Okay, so wanted to show you some images of these non-conventional telescopes. With that, we'll get back to the whiteboard over here, and I will talk about the ALTAS telescope in more detail. Okay, something which we just discussed. So if I want to point at a star, then in the most basic design, I have my telescope tube. What I will do is I'll put one axis like this. I realized I'm not sharing screen. Sorry. Waiting for it to catch up. Yeah. So I have a telescope tube here. I see there are a bunch of questions. Himansh?
Sir, I'm just curious, how did they choose at what altitude to fix the telescope?
They did a whole bunch of studies about what they want to observe. 45 is a good trade-off.
Okay.
If your altitude is fixed to be very high, smaller and smaller fraction of the sky remains accessible. If you are pointing lower, the image quality degrades. We talked about air mass a couple of times in past lectures. So you don't want to point too low. And they did a bunch of evaluation studies and decided 45 was a good trade-off. Akash?
Yes, I was wondering if the reflective material affects the data in any way.
To some extent, yes. Not all material has good reflectivity across all wavelengths. Going back to when I talked about optical filters, some of you asked why some filters were normalized to 1 and others were not. And we had answered that this has telescope efficiency and atmospheric absorption folded in. So that is the same thing. The reflectivity of your material as a function of wavelength, you want it to be very good. In practice, getting such materials are difficult. Especially if you are working in UV and infrared, you have to be very careful with material selection. Glass is not transparent to infrared light. That is why greenhouses are made of glass. So there you have to use few silica and so on. Other materials are used. Okay, so coming back to an ALTAS mount, what I will do is I will actually want I will put an axis like this so that my telescope can be spun around this axis. That would give me the altitude. And then I will want my other axis to be like this, where the telescope can move around like this, and this will be the azimuth. You can clearly see this is a problem. I can't, send two rods through my telescope and expect it to rotate around both. So what you have to do is you start doing different kinds of designs which would make this possible. One of them, for example, is what is called a fork design. So I will mount my tube on this axis. So now the tube can spin like this around this axis, and I can spin it around this axis. This is a fork mount. To make it more clear, again, same telescope. I have my lens here, and I have held it in a U-shape pinch in my hand. So I can rotate it like this. This is my altitude axis, and I can still change it like this at whatever altitude I'm fixing it. That is my azimuth axis. Okay, different variant of this is, okay, so overall this is called a alt as mount because it follows the altitude azimuth system. This is something which someone had asked in the last class. I said we'll cover it next time. So here it is. Different types of alt-az mounts can be made. All the large telescopes around the world these days have altitude azimuth mounts. Keck, for example, is alt-az. VLT is alt-az. Very large telescope, 8-meter telescopes that are in South America. Then Growth India telescope, not very large, but that also is an alt-az mount. So this is the most common type of mounts. Within alt-az, there are variants. This is one variant. Another common variant is called a Dobsonian, which is very popular in amateur astronomy, where essentially what you do is you take a box and the entire box itself can be turned around. So you put a bearing at the base of the box so that the entire box can be turned around like this. And then what you do is you cut some slots in this box. So let me actually use a thicker pen to overdraw the same thing. What I will do now is that I will cut slots on this side of the box and on this side. And then I will cut deeper slots here. Okay, so what I can do now is I can mount a rod over here and I can have another box in it, which would be my telescope. We'll say mirror to round hai, yeah, that's okay. I'll mount my round mirror inside this. Okay, so I have this construction here. Instead of being some complicated shape, boxes are very easy to make. So if you have small telescopes and amateur astronomers who are doing this as a hobby, then Dobsonian is rugged, robust, easy to make, and that's why those are quite common as mounts. Okay. If we are talking about an altitude azimuth mount, then what would you guess the next type of mount is going to be?
Equatorial.
Correct. So for an equatorial mount, what you do is, again, you have the same idea. Okay, so let us revise quickly what the equatorial coordinate system is all about. So I have Earth. Earth has an axis of rotation, and because the Earth is spinning around this axis of rotation only in one way, fortunately not back and forth, what happens is that stars also appear to move around that axis. If I want to point a telescope anywhere in the sky, I have two angles to deal with in general, so I need a two-axis mount. What I now can do is that, suppose I was standing at the North Pole. Okay, so I will take observer 1 who is at the North Pole. What is going to happen is, or as we talked about the South Pole telescope, stars are just going around. Okay, so once I point to a certain star, to point to any star, okay, what I have to do is I have to change my altitude and azimuth both. But after that, a given star at the pole never changes its altitude. So to track it, okay, if I am observing this object for a long time as the stars are going around, then for tracking, I need to only change my azimuth because the altitude above of the star above the horizon is never going to change. That is quite convenient as opposed to an observer over here. Okay, so if I look at the stars as seen by this person in the night sky, what is happening, as we had seen, is that the stars all follow arcs. Okay, so this is my horizon. And the stars all follow arcs. So what is happening is I am changing my altitude and azimuth are always changing. And that is quite inconvenient for two reasons. The first reason is that I have to track on two axes. The second is the reason that we had discussed last time, which is field rotation. Okay, so imagine that I have two objects which are close to each other on the sky. One of them is just above this orange line, and let this be the other object itself. As seen from a telescope which is pointing like this in a certain part of the sky right now, the purple object is to the left of the orange object. They are all actually, suppose both of them have say the same right ascension, so they are actually north south of each other. At culmination, when or at meridian transit, I will now have the purple object above the orange object, and when it is setting, the purple object will now be to the left. Okay, now this effect is actually, you would think that it does not matter a lot, but in a 10-minute exposure in the Growth India telescope, you can actually get star trails if you don't correct for this. So now what I have to do is I have to calculate what this change is going to be. It's not as if आज mood आया purple star थोड़ा आगे चला गया. We know exactly how this is going to change. But what it means is that, so typically in a telescope, what you do is you are going to put a camera, right? You are not going to just stare through the telescope. You want to record your data. You want to quantify it. By eye, you might not be able to measure very small subtle changes in brightness and so on, and you won't be able to measure them very accurately either. Whereas if you take an image with photographic film or with cameras or whatever, you can get very precise measurements. So what we do is we have this camera, and to see fainter objects, we need more light. To get more light, number one, you have built a larger telescope, you have taken a larger aperture, collected more photons per second, but I can also keep looking for a longer amount of time so that you can see fainter objects. These are called deeper exposures. When you see fainter objects, we just called it deeper. So while doing this, it is going to make a big difference that you should be able to see the stars in the same place. If I simply pointed there and I did not do anything, then the stars are going to drift across my field. Okay, so actually this is a small aside that we should take. Okay, why track objects? Okay, so consider an object that is on the equator. Okay, so it's going around the entire, the Earth is finishing one rotation in 24 hours. Slightly less than 24 hours, we'll cover this part of it after mid-sem. But it means that an object on the equator is going to move how many degrees per day? 360 degrees per 24 hours, right? So that is 15 degrees per hour, or that is 15 arc minutes per minute, or 15 arc seconds per second. Everything I'm dividing by 60 on both sides. Okay. The typical field of view of a telescope is order of 10 arc minutes. All right. So what it means is that within a minute, that object will just streak across your entire detector. So you have to track. If you have a ALTAS mount, then in addition to tracking, your entire camera assembly actually has to be rotated around in order to keep tracking this object. Okay, I'm going to try something strange in the middle of the lecture. Teams is warning me that my network quality is not good. So I'm going to try switching Wi-Fi network. So please hold on for a minute. I hope I'm visible again. Can you see and hear me again? Is this? Okay, good. Okay, so field rotation means that I have to actually rotate my entire camera or instrument in order to correct for this effect. So all of that becomes quite messy. We do it these days because technology, actually this turns out to be a better deal. But for certain setups, a much easier idea is that if I can actually have my telescope in the kind of configuration that I would have had on the North Pole, right? Where to point I can move in both axes, but after that I don't have to worry about this field rotation business or anything like that. So in order to do that, I will now go for an equatorial mount. Okay, the name actually can be a bit confusing because I gave the example of the pole, but equatorial is the system that we use. That's why the mount is called an equatorial mount. where what I will do is now this observer who was standing here, okay, instead of taking his or her telescope, so the ground itself is tilted here, okay, and an Altaz telescope would have been mounted like this. So I'm using my same sketch here. Instead of that, what I can do is that I can mount my telescope at an oblique angle. So what I'm doing now is that one axis points to the pole star. Okay, so this telescope axis now, an advantage of this is that I have made this axis parallel to the Earth's axis over here. And because that axis is parallel, okay, any star as it is moving through the night, the angle from the pole star or the declination, 90 minus declination, is never going to change. So I simply have to spin around this axis in order to keep tracking that object. So tracking becomes easier. And now that means, again, I don't have to worry about field rotation anymore. So what I'm doing in an equatorial mount, my Altaz mount was like this. Let's move the lens to our conventional side. This was one motion. This was another motion. As an object is moving through the sky, usually I would have to track along both axes to do this. Instead of that, what I'm now doing is that if that is the North Pole, the way I've been showing the North Pole will be here. So this axis, instead of being vertical, I'm going to incline this axis so that it is pointing to the North Pole. So now when an object is moving, to point to any object, this axis has now become the declination axis, essentially. So I fix it to the declination of the object. And then as the object is moving, I only have to track along one direction. Only one rotation is needed. That also means there is no more problem of field rotation, because what I'm doing is, if you imagine you are an observer here, you are now moving around in the same way. So whatever was left at rising will remain left while it is setting as well. So that takes care of field rotation. That makes tracking much easier. So in an equatorial mount, what you have to do is one axis points to the pole. And as a result, no field rotation. And for tracking, you only have to track on one axis. Okay, this is a common design for smaller telescopes, typically 0.5 meter or less. Of course, there are cases where there are larger equatorial telescopes. The famous 5-meter telescope at Palomar is one of them, where they have an equatorial mount. Now within equatorial mounts, things can get complicated, because now you have to have this entire large telescope supported at very weird angles. So there are many designs within the equatorial mount that have been used, where there are fork mounts, there are yoke mounts, there are horseshoe mounts, and so on. I will share some images of those rather than try to describe them right now. Yes, Kapil.
So when you say points to the pole, you mean parallel to the axis, no?
Correct.
Not actually point to the pole. Like if it was pointing to the pole, then it would be like much further inclined.
North celestial pole. Right, the celestial sphere has a radius of infinity, which means that parallel to the axis means pointing to the pole. I am not pointing to the North Pole of Earth. Then you are right.
Okay.
But,
okay.
So this is one point which, when I learned this for the first time, it took me quite some time to realize. Okay, imagine that I have a star somewhere up here. Okay, if I have this observer and I have another observer over here who is mysteriously floating in air. The line from them to this star, if I draw it in this figure, they seem to be at angles to each other. But that is not really the case. Okay, if both of them are pointing to the same star, for all practical purposes, their lines are parallel to each other. Okay, to put it another way, this offset from the Earth's axis on a cosmic scale of things is irrelevant. All right. To be more technical about it, if we measure the parallax here, okay, the separation between these two people, if they are on the equator, that's going to be the diameter of the Earth, which is about, so this is always less than 12,800 kilometers. Okay. For reference, 1 AU is 1.5 into 10 raised to 8 kilometers. And 1 AU at a distance of 1 parsec was giving you a parallax of 1 arc second. Here we are looking at something which is 1,000 times smaller. So even for the closest stars, you are talking about an offset of a milli-arc second. For most stars, your offsets will be micro-arc seconds or smaller. So you can completely ignore this, and all the equatorial mounts on Earth, for all practical purposes, are pointing parallel to each other. But if you want to be technically correct, then yes, we are pointing to the north celestial pole, the celestial sphere. We talk about theta phi, we don't talk about r. R can be infinity.
Okay, sir.
This brings me to yes. Go ahead.
Sir, pointing to the perpendicular to the axis of the rotation, that can also work, right?
If you pointed perpendicular to the axis of the rotation, that can be done, but that does not give you any advantage. Because now what you are doing is that, see, remember that these two axes, the vertical and horizontal axis that I am talking about, this one and this one, are not interchangeable. They are not symmetric. Okay, rotations don't commute. So what it means is that if the pole star was above me, okay, imagine for simplicity so that I don't have to hold my hand at odd angles. Suppose I'm at the North Pole, pole star is above me. What I'm doing is I'm setting this to match the declination and then I'm tracking happily. Okay. Instead of that, now imagine I'm at the equator so that the pole star is there along the horizon, but I have mounted this axis so an equatorial mount would have been like this. Instead of that, I'm mounting it perpendicular. Now to track a star, what would I have to do? First, I have to match its declination. But then by rotating this way, the stars are not going around in circles like this. The stars are going around in circles like this. So I would have to still move both axes to track it. So that does not give you any advantage in terms of the telescope mount. That's why that is never used. What we use is a Altaz mount because then one axis is vertical, one is horizontal. Gravity is vertical at any local point. So that has some mechanical advantages and simplicity in manufacturing. Or we make it parallel to the Earth's axis, which gives us these advantages with field rotation and tracking.
Okay, sir.
Okay, now talking about tracking, okay, we said that our typical image sizes are about 1 arc second. Let's try to understand that in context. So it means that when I'm tracking my telescope, my pointing and tracking accuracy, angular accuracy has to be better than 1 arc second, right? Because otherwise the stars will start smearing out. That is like when you're trying to take a picture on your mobile from a fast moving car, because objects are moving around, they all are going to appear blurred, loosely speaking. So how accurately do we have to worry about pointing? So let's consider one of these large telescopes. Okay, I'm going to draw a simplified design here where let's say that I have this telescope which has a 10-meter mirror. Okay, so the aperture is 10 meters. I have light that is coming in, and let us assume for simplicity that we are talking only about the primary focus over here. Now these mirrors, yeah, this is another concept. Let me go back to these slides over here. Okay, so there is something called the F ratio, which is the ratio of the focal length F divided by the aperture D. Okay, focal length divided by the aperture. And this is commonly used while comparing telescope characteristics. So for example, if this telescope had, let's say that if I have F is equal to 100 centimeters and my primary was 70 centimeters, let's use simpler numbers. So let's say focal length, suppose example, F equal to 100 centimeters and D is equal to, let's say, 20 centimeters. Then this is called a F by 5 telescope. Okay. It is written as F/5. Sometimes we just call it F5, sometimes F by 5. And this is called the F ratio. Okay, so these very large telescopes, that's just some nomenclature that you should know. These very large telescopes typically have, they are what are called fast telescopes. So the F ratio is typically around 1, which means that the focal length here is also 10 meters. Okay, so now as the source is moving around in the sky, you want to take this entire 10-meter structure and track it. Okay, 10 meters is large. If this mirror was standing vertically, that would be about 3 floors. Each floor is just over 3 meters. Okay, 10 meters is just over 30 feet. So now what I have to do is I have to keep this focus here, or whatever camera I am holding at my prime focus has to be tracked very accurately so that the net displacement is less than 1 arc second. So let us try this. 1 arc second is equal to tan of max, or rather tan of 1 arc second is equal to the maximum displacement that is allowed divided by the focal length. Okay, and this number we have talked about, this is also the same conversion between AU and parsec, that's also 1 arc second. So we know that this number is 1 upon 2 into 10 raised to 5. Okay, so the max displacement that I can have is my focal length, which is 10 meters divided by 2 into 10 raised to 5. How much is this? जनता बेसिक डिवीजन है 10 डिवाइडेड बाय 2 into 10 raised to 5 कितना होता है
0.5
5 into 10
mm.
raised to minus 5.
Is this correct? 50 microns?
Yes, sir.
Okay, for comparison, your hair are about 100 micron thick. So we are talking about having something which is as tall as the physics department, and I want to turn it around, and the camera which is mounted at the end has to be positioned accurately to better than 50 microns. Okay, 50 microns is bad. That would give you 1 arc second distortion. You want it 10 times better. So you want it like 5 microns, 10 microns or something like that. So this is a huge engineering challenge just to make sure that telescopes can actually track and point accurately. And for that, these days we use a variety of active techniques. We use sensors which are measuring this. So old days we just used to make extremely heavy and rigid mounts, very strong mounts. These days the philosophy has changed. We actually design the mounts to be very light. We put a lot of sensors. We measure how much the telescope is flexing. If you are having trouble thinking of this, imagine holding a 30-foot long stick and you are trying to point it somewhere, the stick is going to bend. Anything flexes in real life. So as you are doing that, what we do is we have sensors that can measure that flexure, and then we actually correct for it. Sometimes we correct it in post-processing. Sometimes we have a set of motors or something that will actually move the camera to compensate for this. Someone had their hand up. Any doubts?
Yeah, I was just asking what's the general order of proper velocity of some stars?
Sorry, what's the general order of?
The proper velocity of any star.
Proper velocity of stars.
Yeah, I think that's what, you know, how stars have velocity and they move in the sky.
It's relevant to the current lecture.
Okay.
Right now I'm talking about tracking stars, not because stars are moving, because Earth is rotating.
No, I understand that, but yeah, a slight doubt that came from that discussion.
Okay, we'll discuss it later. Okay. Okay, I'll just answer it. The largest proper motions are few arc seconds per year. Typical proper motions are much smaller than that. The actual velocities in space can be tens to hundreds of kilometers per second. Those are called proper velocities, but they are so far away that most of them will give you much smaller proper motion. All right, so we've talked about telescopes, we have talked about Altaz mounts, we have talked about equatorial mounts. Do you think we can have something like a ecliptic mount or a galactic mount?
I mean, that's a space telescope, yes.
If there are two axes, we can have any type of mount, right? It would just be not be convenient.
Correct. So ecliptic mount would become relevant only if you are in space where you actually can have one axis mounted perpendicular to the ecliptic. On Earth, what will happen is that the ecliptic itself is going around as seen from Earth. Remember when I was showing you stellarium, the yellow line corresponding to the ecliptic was always changing, which means that there is no fixed rigid axis that would be perpendicular to the ecliptic. Same thing about the galactic plane. So those are not useful. Once you are in space, pointing around becomes an entirely different game altogether. If you have an inertial system set in space, it will just stay pointing there. In practice, again, you have to do some corrections and so on, but completely different ball game. So in practice, equatorial and Altaz are the only two mount systems that we need to worry about. Someone else had their hand up? Yes, Prathamesh.
Sir, one more slightly question related to telescopes. How do we select the sites of where to build the telescope?
That is quite an interesting thing. So telescope site selection. Let me come back to it in the last 5 minutes if we have time, okay?
Sure.
All right. Any other doubts so far?
Varun, just a reminder, we are 12 minutes over 5.
Oh, sorry. I was somehow thinking of 5:30. Okay. Sorry. Thanks for pointing that out, Gaurav. We are well over time. So telescope site selection discussion will not happen today. I have no idea why I was thinking of 5:30. Let's stop here right away and bye. We'll continue
Sir,
the next lecture.
sir,
Yes.
so we can like post even detailed and particular queries about the project on general teams on Teams channel, right?
On the projects channel, yes.
Okay, sir.
And we will answer them there, yes. The team which was talking about Nebulae, who was that team?
Yes, sir.
So you people should hang back. The rest can now disconnect the meeting. Thanks all. Bye.
Varun, there was one doubt which